Allison Moore had never considered herself sentimental, but there was something undeniably spiritual about the first time she stood barefoot on the edge of her newly acquired lakefront property. The pebbles were cool beneath her feet, the wind off the water thick with pine and a faint memory of rain, and for the first time in years, she felt a kind of silence she hadn't known she needed. It wasn't the quiet of her downtown apartment, muffled by the mechanical hum of elevators and distant sirens. This was a different kind of stillness, earthy, old, and unmoved by the pace of human intention. The lake, vast and smooth as glass, reflected back an indifference that felt almost wise. Here, in this untouched corner of the county where few tourists ever ventured, Allison had found a slice of the world that did not care who she had been or what she had run from. The move had not been spontaneous. For 3 years, Allison had worked with methodical discipline to untangle herself from a life that had grown steadily more claustrophobic. A failed business partnership, a silent separation from a man who never really understood her, and a city whose rhythms no longer matched her own had led her, step by step, toward this. Her savings, modest but untouched, had become a ticket not to luxury, but to quiet defiance. She had bought the lake house site unseen, save for one in-person visit late last fall when the wind was bitter and the dock was partially submerged. Most people would have waited for spring or brought an inspector. Allison didn't. She wanted something that didn't come polished and packaged. The place needed work. The porch sagged slightly on the south end, the electrical was outdated, and the land had been overgrown. But it was hers. And for the first time, that meant something. In the weeks that followed her arrival, she threw herself into restoration not as a project but as a process. Morning light became her clock, coffee her ritual, and work her anchor. She pruned back the brambles that had swallowed the back edge of the property, learned how to unclog a septic line without calling for help, and painted her front door a stubborn, unapologetic red. Every nail she hammered, every board she sanded, reclaimed not just a house but her sense of ownership over her own life. Neighbors came and went, some offering shy waves, others deliberate silence. It didn't matter. Allison wasn't there to make friends. She wasn't trying to fit in. She had done all that before, and it had led her nowhere. This place, this strange and stunningly quiet corner of the world, wasn't about being seen. It was about disappearing, but on her terms. And yet, people noticed. Or rather, one person noticed, early and intensely. Karen lived 2 properties over, in a blue-gray single-story house trimmed with white lattice and festooned year-round with various seasonal flags. She had introduced herself not during one of Allison's early walks or casual runs into town, but on a day when Allison had been hauling a heavy coil of hose across the gravel path leading to the dock. The woman had appeared with suddenness, standing stiffly just outside the property line like someone executing an official visit. She had not smiled. She had not offered baked goods or small talk. She had looked down at the hose in Allison's hands, then up at her face and said, with the clear, slow tone of someone used to controlling a room, "Are you aware that this stretch of shoreline echoes like a canyon after 8 p.m.? Allison, caught, off guard and soaked in sweat, had blinked at her. "I'm sorry?" Karen had crossed her arms and nodded at the lake. "Sound carries, and this place has rules. You should probably familiarize yourself with them if you plan to entertain." Entertain. The word lingered like a warning, and though Allison had politely responded, "Of course, I'll keep that in mind," something about the exchange set off a quiet chord of alert inside her. It wasn't the warning itself. She could respect people's comfort. It was the tone, the subtle implication that she was already expected to fall in line. Karen had spoken as though she held authority over the land, the water, and Allison's place among them. Not in any official way. No, Karen wasn't a marshal or an elected official. Her power came from something more corrosive. Time, presence and the soft monopoly of being the first one to speak, the one to assert what everyone knows. Allison filed it away. She didn't start conflicts, but she also didn't tolerate control dressed as community. Weeks passed, the wind shifted, and spring began its quiet creep across the region. Tree buds opened, fishermen began to appear on the far end of the lake, and birdsong returned with such volume it felt orchestrated. Allison made good progress on the interior of the house, converting one of the side rooms into a workshop for refurbishing small outboard engines. It was a hobby, not a business, not yet. But it gave her joy. More than that, it gave her something tangible to work toward. Still, she kept to herself. That was the point. She didn't attend the bi-weekly neighborhood mixers. She declined invitations to join the Lake Women's Wellness Circle. And she didn't answer the veiled social questions that came wrapped in passive-aggressive compliments. It wasn't that she was unfriendly. She just wasn't for everyone. And she was okay with that. So, when she decided to mark the one-year anniversary of her sister's death with something quiet and personal, she knew it might raise a few eyebrows. But she didn't care. Her sister, Lainey, had loved water, loved live music, loved long summer nights and the kind of food that took hours to prepare and seconds to devour. Allison wanted to honor that, not with grief, but with celebration. A simple gathering, 3 friends driving in from out of town, 1 local chef she'd hired to cater, and a guitarist who could play Simon and Garfunkel by heart. It wasn't a party, it wasn't a rave, it was remembrance, and it would be legal. She didn't take chances. She went directly to the sheriff's office a week prior and filed all the necessary paperwork. She included a detailed timeline, expected head count, even the music set list. The sheriff's assistant, a square-jawed woman named Robin who looked like she'd been through more than one rural feud, skimmed the forms and said, "You're good. Just stay within the decibel limit and cut it off by midnight." Allison agreed. She even printed out a copy of the permit to have on hand. Just in case. She didn't post about it. She didn't tell the neighbors. There were no decorations, no party signs, no overflow parking. It was private, intentional, and brief. But as sunset began to stain the lake in shades of bronze and auburn, and the first notes of acoustic melody drifted across the calm water, she saw the shape. A silhouette, rigid and unmoving, standing half-concealed behind a tree on the lot line. Arms crossed, eyes fixed, Karen. She made no move to approach, no attempt to join, to engage, or to speak. She stood like a judge at a distance, absorbing every movement, every note, every flicker of candlelight with the intensity of someone compiling a list of violations. Allison noticed, and she looked away. Because this night was not about Karen. But that was the thing with people like her. It never mattered what it was about. If it wasn't theirs, they'd find a way to make it so. And in that moment, standing at the edge of a gathering meant to honor a life, Allison felt something shift. Not fear, not dread, but a slow, creeping awareness that the land she had chosen for its peace might soon become the center of a storm she had never invited, but could no longer avoid. It was a little after 8 the next morning when Allison stepped out onto her porch with a mug of coffee in hand, the air still cool and the scent of damp earth rising from the shore. The lake was calm, save for the occasional ripple left by ducks or drifting pollen. The party had ended quietly the night before, exactly at midnight. The guests had stayed long enough to help clean up. Empty glasses, candle stubs, stray napkins. The guitarist had packed his instrument in silence, offering a warm nod of understanding when Allison thanked him again for being part of something that wasn't just about music. They had all left respectfully, their cars moving slowly down the gravel road to avoid kicking up dust or waking anyone. It had been the kind of evening Allison had hoped for. Small, heartfelt, unintrusive. She had double-checked the site, picked up every scrap of trash, and ensured the deck lights were turned off before locking the door behind her. She'd gone to bed with a rare sense of peace. It lasted less than 10 hours. On the porch rail sat a sealed envelope, standard white, placed carefully beside her potted basil, as if meant to appear casual. There was no postage, no name, just property matter, urgent, typed in all caps across the center. Allison stared at it for a long moment before setting her mug down and picking it up. The paper inside crackled as she unfolded it, a typed notice that struck immediately as something official but not quite legal. It read like a demand letter cobbled together from online templates, peppered with buzzwords: nuisance activity, violation of shoreline peace statute, risk of public disturbance. At the bottom was a name in elaborate cursive: Karen Albright. Underneath it, Resident Oversight Liaison, Lakeshore Preservation Group. Allison almost laughed. She had heard of that group. It wasn't a government body or even a non-profit. It was a loosely organized collection of long-term residents, Karen chief among them, who considered themselves stewards of the lake's legacy. They weren't elected. They weren't recognized by any official board, but they had weight, not because of authority, but because of repetition. Enough letters, enough calls, enough petitions, and they could slow down property permits or prompt informal investigations. It was bureaucracy by persistence, and Karen had mastered it. The letter demanded a response within 48 hours. It referenced a section of municipal code from the 1970s that was supposedly still on the books, concerning unauthorized nighttime events involving amplified sound or artificial lighting within 100 feet of a natural shoreline. It warned that any future activities of a similar nature would be considered malicious disruption and could result in formal complaints to zoning, waterway management, or even environmental regulation boards. The kicker came at the end. Should further disturbances occur, this matter will escalate beyond neighborly remedy and into legal territory. You have been warned. Allison reread the letter slowly, then folded it and placed it back in the envelope. Her hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer gall of it. She walked back inside, opened a file drawer, and pulled out the permit she had obtained from the sheriff's office. It was clear, concise, and sealed. It specified date, time, decibel thresholds, parking allowances, and even fire code compliance for the open flame candles she had used on the dock. She snapped a photo of it, then set it on the kitchen counter beside the envelope. For a brief moment she considered ignoring the whole thing. But she knew better. Ignoring people like Karen didn't make them go away. It emboldened them. By noon, Allison was at the county municipal building, tucked in a line between a man paying a property tax discrepancy and a woman applying for a business license. When her number was called, she stepped forward and asked to speak with someone about shoreline usage ordinances. She was directed to an administrative desk where a weary-looking clerk greeted her with polite confusion. As Allison laid out the letter and the permit, the woman behind the desk frowned and pulled up a digital file on her screen. "I'm going to stop you right there," she said. "We get something like this every few months, this exact statute, this exact complaint. It's technically still on the books, but it hasn't been enforced since 1984, when the new zoning overlays were put in place. Your permit supersedes it. You're fine." Allison exhaled slowly. "So this doesn't require any kind of written response?" The clerk shook her head. "No. But if she submits a formal complaint, you may have to appear before the zoning board, just for record keeping. They usually dismiss it in 5 minutes." She lowered her voice. "Off the record, Ms. Albright has been making these sorts of claims for years. Most folks just cave to avoid the drama." Allison straightened. "I won't." "Good," the clerk said, leaning forward slightly, "because that's usually what it takes to make her back off. The first pushback." Allison returned home with a renewed sense of clarity. She made copies of her permit, documented the time, location, and circumstances of the event in a typed summary and added photos from the night. Soft lights, spaced seating, and nothing that could even remotely resemble a disturbance. She placed it all in a folder labeled Incident, Lake Evening, and set it in the cabinet alongside her property deeds and insurance documents. It was the kind of preparation she hoped she'd never need, but the kind she respected too much to avoid. She thought that might be the end of it. A warning shot fired, a measured response, and now silence. But it wasn't. 2 days later, a county vehicle pulled into her driveway. A man in khakis and a green windbreaker stepped out, clipboard in hand. He introduced himself as Dale Rogers, field assessor for shoreline usage compliance. "Got a request to check some dock modifications and verify erosion barriers," he said. His tone wasn't aggressive, but there was a clear edge of procedural obligation. Allison offered him coffee and showed him the dock. Nothing had been modified since she purchased the home, except for the repair of 3 planks that had been loose and dangerously rotted. Dale took pictures, measured distances, and asked to see her permit. She provided it, and he nodded with a grunt of approval. "This looks in order," he said, "but sometimes we have to document anyway. Part of the paper trail. You'll likely get a form letter in a week or 2 saying everything's compliant. Don't stress it." As he left, Allison noticed the way his eyes lingered across the lake, towards the direction of Karen's house. There was something in his look, not fear exactly, but fatigue. He had been through this routine before. Later that evening, Allison noticed that someone had moved her trash bins. Not knocked over, not vandalized, just repositioned precisely 2 feet to the left, directly in front of her mailbox, enough to block postal delivery. She didn't call anyone. She didn't yell. She simply moved them back, measured the distance, and added a photo to her folder. By the weekend, it escalated again. A note, written in thin blue ink on torn notebook paper, was taped to the back gate of her property. It read, "Noise echoes. Neighbors remember. Tradition matters. Don't forget that." There was no name, no date, but the message was unmistakably personal. Allison did not respond. She did not speak Karen's name aloud, but in her mind, a quiet threshold had been crossed. This was no longer a passive disagreement over local norms. This was surveillance, quiet interference, a campaign of presence. Karen wasn't simply bothered. She was declaring a kind of war, the cold, paper-heavy, polite sort of war that made itself legal before it made itself loud. Allison, standing on her porch that night, looking out at the lake that had first drawn her in with its stillness, felt that silence shift into something else. Not quite danger. Not yet. But a promise that it would not end here. And in the dark water, reflecting the faint crescent moon, she saw not peace, but the ripple of something approaching. Something slow, methodical, and entirely unwelcome. By the time the official letter arrived, embossed with the county seal and folded in triplicate, Allison was no longer surprised. She had come to expect paper. Where others might throw bricks, Karen threw letters. Where people raised their voices, she raised citations. And this one, though dressed in polite bureaucracy, was unmistakably hers. It informed Allison that, due to a pending procedural inquiry initiated by a resident oversight representative, a temporary hold had been placed on her shoreline access privileges. The phrasing was delicate, but the impact was direct. Until further notice, she was not to use her dock for organized or non-domestic gatherings, structural modifications, or marine entry of any kind. No canoe, no fishing, no visitors by boat. The justification: suspected non-compliance with Section 3B, Residential Shoreline Etiquette Protocols. Allison stared at the phrase, baffled by its invented legality. There was no such enforceable section in county code, only a suggestion buried deep within an outdated handbook written by a local historical preservation club. one Karen had chaired in 2011. Still, the freeze was real. Technically not a violation, not a punishment, but a procedural review, which in local government meant weeks, sometimes months, of silence before someone lifted a pen to write "resolved." And this one had come through proper channels, meaning someone inside the system had processed it, filed it, and applied it to her property. Allison wasn't dealing with an eccentric neighbor anymore. She was up against machinery, however old and slow, that Karen knew how to manipulate. Instead of reacting impulsively, Allison drove straight to the county building the next morning, this time with a folder full of documents, permit copies, date-stamped photos, correspondence, even a notarized statement from her guests confirming the nature of the event. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't ask for special treatment. She sat down with a zoning compliance officer named Richard Neville, whose lined face and tired eyes suggested he'd been through more than his share of neighbor disputes. As she laid out the timeline and pushed forward her documents, he listened, said little, and, at the end, simply nodded. "I'll initiate a priority review," he said. "But these holds, once triggered, need sign-off from multiple departments. If you want to speed things up, have someone from Waterway Safety or Environmental Oversight send me a recommendation to clear it." So that's what she did. Over the next 48 hours, Allison made calls, sent emails, requested inspections, and paid 2 small processing fees to expedite site evaluations. It wasn't about pride, it was about pressure. She understood now what Karen was doing. The goal wasn't just to stop the gathering, it was to drown her in procedure, to make life so logistically difficult that she'd give up, move out, leave the lake to the people who thought it was theirs by tenure alone. Allison wasn't wired to quit, and if Karen wanted to play administrative chess, she would meet her at every move. What Allison didn't expect, what caught her completely off guard, was how quickly Karen escalated once she saw her tactics weren't working. It began with sound. At precisely 5:57 a.m., the following Saturday, a loud oscillating hum began emanating from somewhere near the shared tree line between their properties. It wasn't music or machinery or an engine. It was a tone, a modulated frequency that sat somewhere between lawn equipment and alarm systems, designed to be just unbearable enough to wake someone, but not so offensive as to violate noise ordinances. It lasted 22 minutes, stopped, then started again at 7:13. This pattern repeated daily for 4 days. Allison filed a noise complaint on day 2, but the inspector who arrived, an affable man in an oversized vest, couldn't detect the sound during his midday visit. "Probably a faulty sprinkler system," he offered, smiling. On day 5, the hum was replaced with motion, a motion-detecting floodlight mounted just beyond Karen's shed, now blasted across the yard whenever Allison stepped onto her back porch. It lit up her entire deck like a parking garage, harsh and sterile, throwing shadows against her windows and washing out the view of the lake. The light turned on any time a squirrel moved through the trees, any time Allison opened a door, any time she exhaled near the edge of her property. She tried speaking to Karen once. It was early evening, the light had just snapped on again, and she called across the hedges, calm but firm. "Karen, I don't want to escalate anything, but your light is pointed directly at my house." There was a pause, a shuffling sound behind the lattice, and then Karen's voice, dry and perfectly neutral. "Safety's more important than scenery. Don't you agree?" Allison could have screamed. She could have stormed over the line and ripped the light off the pole. But she didn't. She noted the incident, photographed the light, checked the zoning rule on exterior fixtures, and filed a non-emergency complaint. Again, every step documented, every action precise. Then came the packages. 3 deliveries arrived within the same week, all addressed to Ms. Allison Muir, with slight misspellings and incorrect house numbers. One contained 24 blank noise complaint forms, printed from the county website. Another was filled with laminated flyers about firework-related trauma and wildlife. The third was simply a bundle of community harmony pamphlets with a sticky note attached. "We've always protected this place. That's why it's special." Allison began to wonder who else Karen had enlisted. Which neighbors shared her opinions? Who had signed her petitions? Who quietly believed she was a disruption to their peace, their memories, their legacy of ownership? It wasn't paranoia, just calculation. She started walking the perimeter of her lot twice a day, checking for anything unusual. One morning she found the gate hinge unscrewed. Another, a trail of pine straw carefully arranged in a line that led from her dock to the shed on the edge of her lot. Nothing illegal, nothing provable, just patterns, intentions, signs. Meanwhile, the county review dragged on. She received 3 letters in the span of 2 weeks, each from a different department, all stating that investigations are ongoing. Her appeal to lift the dock freeze sat in limbo. Her business, already slow in the off-season, suffered further as potential buyers from a neighboring town canceled a meeting after hearing there were zoning issues on her land. Word was spreading, or rather, suggestion was, the implication that Allison was a problem, that her presence was disruptive, that she didn't respect the lake, and perhaps most disturbing of all, no one came to her defense. Not the part-time neighbor 2 houses down who'd once complimented her repairs. Not the retired couple who bought her old lawnmower. Not the man with the dog who always waved but never spoke. They weren't hostile. They were absent, disappeared behind hedges and blinds and small talk. That silence was louder than any letter. Allison knew, without being told, that this was the real campaign. The slow push. The message, unsaid but deeply felt. You don't belong here. She didn't respond. She kept mowing her lawn. She maintained her repairs. She filed every letter, printed every email, and when the inspectors returned, this time without clipboard jokes or casual detachment, she met them at the gate with a binder in hand. What she didn't know was that Karen had one more card to play, and it would come not in the form of noise or light or paper. It would come in the form of accusation, and it was already on its way. The envelope looked different this time. Not a typed complaint, not a passive-aggressive flyer or another municipal form. This one was thick, yellow, and bore the unmistakable red stamp of Notice of Formal Review, Land Use Concern. It came not from a neighborhood committee or the ever-multiplying web of preservation groups, but directly from the County Planning and Property Oversight Division. Inside, Allison found a 3-page document that, for the first time in weeks, made her breath catch. It was a formal allegation, submitted anonymously through a system that allowed residents to flag suspected violations of historical shoreline boundary agreements. The language was dense, but the message was clear. Someone had accused Allison of building her dock, and possibly a portion of her deck, over land that had never legally transferred with her purchase. The accusation stated that her lot may encroach onto what was formerly designated as a shared buffer zone, a term from decades-old subdivision agreements that had been retired in practice but, apparently, not fully extinguished in record. Allison knew exactly where the accusation came from. The timing, the specificity, the vagueness dressed in bureaucracy. It had Karen's fingerprints all over it. But this time, it wasn't noise or lights. This was legal territory. This wasn't an annoyance. This could, if left unaddressed or poorly handled, lead to the county placing a lien on her property or forcing a partial removal of structures. She read the document again, slower, and something in her shifted. Not panic, not outrage. Focus. There was no room now for anything but precision. She didn't attempt to decode the boundary issue herself. She wasn't going to fall into the trap of playing lawyer. Instead, she made a single phone call to the title agency that had handled her closing. She asked for a certified copy of her parcel's plat map and a copy of the closing boundary survey. Within 24 hours, she had both in hand. Then, she made a second call, to a licensed property surveyor with regional experience. She didn't pick one from Google. She asked the agency who they used to verify closings and scheduled an in-person review. The man who showed up, Walt Remsen, had been working boundary cases for 30 years. He didn't wear a tie. He didn't bring small talk. He walked the property, took out instruments, marked flags, and when he returned the next day, he brought a simple, quiet statement. Your dock's within limits. The deck, too. The county maps are old, but you're clean. If someone wants to challenge it, they're going to need more than opinion. Allison asked him to notarize that statement and attach a copy of his survey findings. He agreed. She added the report to her growing binder and mailed a registered response to the county office. Every document was time-stamped, signed, sealed. She wasn't trying to win a war. She was defending a line, and she wasn't doing it with anger. She was doing it with facts. That changed the rhythm. Still, the process was slow. The planning office had to consider the validity of the concern, and despite the documentation, she was told the matter would need to appear on the docket of the next property review hearing, a monthly event attended by zoning representatives, environmental review officers, and public comment participants. The clerk advised her to bring visuals if possible and to expect interruption. Allison thanked her and didn't ask why. When she arrived at the hearing, held in a room that smelled of dust and old linoleum, she carried a USB with every scanned document plus printed copies. There were 6 people in attendance. 3 zoning officials, a secretary, an assistant from the assessor's office, and in the back row, Karen, not seated directly behind Allison, but angled enough to see both her and the panel. She wore a soft blue cardigan, glasses that hung from a silver chain, and the faintest trace of a smile. When it was Allison's turn to present, she stood without any dramatics, without apologies, and methodically explained her ownership, the history of the lot, and the licensed surveyor's conclusions. When the chair of the committee asked for clarification about the buffer zone, she handed them a highlighted portion of a 1987 plat that marked the buffer as dissolved by subsequent redrawing of private parcels. She did not raise her voice. She did not speak about Karen. She let the document speak. For 5 minutes the room was silent except for the rustling of paper. Then, during the public comment portion, Karen stood. Her voice was soft, slow, and dressed in the tone of concerned stewardship. I'm not here to accuse anyone, she began, only to protect what this lake has meant to generations of families. The maps can be confusing. Memories don't lie. I remember when this stretch of land was open to the community. It wasn't about ownership. It was about respect. That's what's missing now. The panel thanked her. No questions were asked. The hearing concluded without a decision. Under review, they said, but Allison already knew. She hadn't just defended her property. She had exposed the tactic. And she had done it calmly, publicly, and with more grace than Karen expected. Later that night, back at home, Allison stepped out onto her dock. The water was still. No lights glared, no hums buzzed. Even the air felt unusually neutral. She sat on the edge, legs dangling above the glassy surface, and stared out into the dark. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like a break. A pause in a battle she hadn't asked for, against someone who wasn't just fighting her, but the very idea of change. And in that moment, Allison made a quiet promise. If Karen wanted this fight to be about the lake, about respect, about boundaries, then she would meet her on those terms. But she wouldn't play defense anymore. From now on, every move would be deliberate, every response strategic. No more hoping for peace. This was about permanence. It began again, as things often did around the lake, not with action, but with implication. The silence after the county hearing lingered for a week. Then 2, during which Allison maintained her property, worked on engine parts in the shed, and continued her careful documentation of everything even remotely suspicious. There were no new letters, no visits, no procedural holds. It was tempting to believe, for a moment, that the pressure had broken and the storm passed. But Allison had learned not to believe in silence. Around Karen, silence wasn't peace. It was planning. The first sign came on a Tuesday. Allison noticed a man standing on the far side of the lake path that skirted her property. He wasn't walking, didn't have a dog, and wasn't wearing the light windbreakers typical of the retired locals who made a habit of the mid-morning strolls. He was tall, solid, middle-aged, with mirrored sunglasses and a handheld radio clipped to his belt. He didn't approach or wave. He simply stood, as if surveying, then turned and walked back toward the neighborhood's southern entrance. Allison didn't follow. She marked the time, his direction, and noted it in her log. A one-off, perhaps, but she doubted it. The next morning, she received a voicemail from an unfamiliar number. The woman identified herself as a private compliance liaison, representing Environmental Code Coordination, and requested a callback regarding potential discrepancies in water runoff containment observed during a site perimeter review. The message was courteous, professional, and utterly opaque. Allison returned the call within the hour. The woman, Diana Meyer, introduced herself with a breezy friendliness that barely masked the formalism in her tone. "Nothing alarming," she assured. "Just a note passed along from a review team that spotted some questionable drainage direction near the northeast edge of your lawn. Not uncommon near lakes, especially older homes. Happens all the time." Allison knew exactly which edge she meant. The slope where Karen's property line tilted slightly toward hers, draining water after rain. Allison had built a simple trench there to redirect excess water away from her crawl space. A perfectly reasonable, minimal measure. And yet, someone had noted it. Diana suggested a voluntary inspection to get ahead of any issues. Allison, already exhausted from the pattern, agreed on the condition that the findings be issued in writing. Diana accepted. The inspection took place 2 days later. Allison watched from the window as Diana, accompanied by 2 others with clipboards and an actual soil probe, moved across her lawn with a casual deliberateness that spoke of practiced performance. They took pictures, measured nothing, and within 30 minutes were gone. 2 days later, Allison received an email. Not a warning, but a pre-corrective notice, citing ambiguous alteration of groundwater behavior, and a suggestion that the property owner consider a drainage consultation to ensure long-term ecological harmony. It wasn't a violation. It was a setup. The first domino in another slow-motion campaign. But this time, the strategy had shifted. Karen wasn't just trying to isolate or inconvenience. She was trying to tarnish Allison's reputation, her legitimacy, her right to the space. That became undeniable when, the following week, Allison was informed by the Lakeside Home Partnership Group, a private neighborhood alliance that handled soft coordination between long-term residents and the county, that a complaint had been submitted regarding public conduct and moral suitability. The phrase made Allison laugh out loud. Suitability? She wasn't a daycare employee or a teacher. She lived on private land. But the complaint was real. It alleged that during her evening gathering, now over a month past, guests had consumed illicit substances, exposed minors to unpermitted adult activity, and engaged in disruptive lakefront behavior inconsistent with community values. The source was anonymous. The language was vague, but the implications were serious. Allison, for the first time, considered getting a lawyer. Not because she feared legal consequences, but because she was beginning to understand the scale of what Karen was capable of. This wasn't about her dock or her candles. This was character assassination, a public effort to label her an outsider, a threat, a problem to be removed. She consulted a local attorney, Jacqueline Dunn, recommended by the same title agency who'd helped her before. Jacqueline, calm and unimpressed by theatrics, read through the complaints, nodded, and said, "This is textbook soft harassment. She's throwing shadows and hoping one of them sticks." She advised Allison not to respond directly, but to begin building a formal record of retaliatory behavior in case litigation became necessary. In the meantime, Allison kept moving. She held off on hosting any events, avoided contact with neighbors, and channeled her attention into restoring the small boathouse that had come with the property. It was old, crooked, and half sunk into the shoreline, but she made slow progress. It grounded her, but the attacks didn't stop. One evening, she returned home from town to find a stack of glossy flyers pinned to her gate, dozens of them, all bearing the logo of a local Lake Life Ethics Coalition, a group she'd never heard of, warning about unaccountable transplants, disturbing established harmony. She took them down silently, counted the pages, and added them to the growing binder. The next escalation came from an unexpected angle. A permit she had applied for weeks prior to build a new shade structure over the back patio was denied. The reason given: pending investigation of land use consistency. No explanation, no timeline. Just a red stamp. Allison called the planning department. They transferred her 4 times, finally landing on a voicemail box with no callback. A week later, she received a letter noting concerned resident feedback regarding improper use of public viewshed space. Another fabricated phrase. Another baseless hurdle. But it wasn't just paperwork now. Karen had begun leveraging people. 2 local businesses, one that had agreed to resurface her deck and another that had offered to deliver stone for her pathway, both backed out within days of each other. No specific reason, just change in scheduling or resource reallocation. One of the subcontractors, a younger man named Ty, showed up in person to return her deposit. Quietly, he admitted, "Look, off the record, I got a call. Someone saying they'd heard you were difficult to work with, that there'd been issues with permits. I don't care, but my boss told me to walk." Allison felt it like a blow to the gut. Not because it was personal. She didn't care if Karen thought she was rude, but because it meant Karen was working the network. Making calls. Whispering poison into the fabric of local business, knowing full well that in small towns, reputation moved faster than evidence. Still, Allison refused to retaliate emotionally. She refused to leave angry voicemails or post offensive screeds online. Instead, she built her wall of evidence. She photographed everything, saved every canceled invoice, documented every instance where she was told, "Someone raised a concern." Her binder was now 3 inches thick, but the final push, the moment she knew the game had turned into something darker, came one humid evening as thunderheads rolled silently over the lake. Allison stepped outside to close the storage hatch on her dock just as she noticed something in the water. At first, she thought it was driftwood. Then she saw the shape. A floating bouquet of white lilies, tied with black ribbon, bumping gently against the edge of her platform. Attached was a laminated card, waterlogged but legible. For what was lost beneath this shore? Not all grief is loud. It wasn't a threat, it wasn't illegal, but it was chilling. The insinuation that her presence, her event, her celebration, had disturbed a memory so sacred it could only be mourned with theatrical mourning. Karen had staged a wake and used the lake as its altar. Allison stood there, motionless, the dock damp beneath her feet, the air electric with a storm not yet arrived. And she realized something essential. Karen didn't just want her gone. She wanted the lake back in the image of her memory, untouched, unaltered, purified of change. And Allison, no matter how respectful, how cautious, how careful, represented everything Karen feared: the new, the uncontrolled, the uninvited. She picked up the bouquet and walked it to the shed. She placed it inside, not out of reverence, but because she wasn't going to let it rot in her water. Then she returned to her house, opened her binder, and began composing a new report. Not to the planning board, or the preservation society, or any anonymous group. This time, it would go to a higher office, and this time, it wouldn't be defensive. It would be formal. It would be comprehensive, and it would name Karen directly. The complaint Allison filed was not reactive or emotional. It was crafted like a legal thesis, thorough, methodical, supported by evidence, and presented with the exact calm professionalism that often speaks louder than outrage. She submitted it directly to the county commissioner's office, bypassing the local zoning and property departments entirely, opting instead for the branch responsible for citizen integrity hearings, where persistent community disruptions rooted in targeted retaliation or abuse of procedure could trigger investigation. Her file was 63 pages long, with color-coded tabs and chronological documentation of every formal and informal action taken against her since the first letter appeared on her porch. It included screenshots, signed statements, municipal filings, audio transcripts of voicemails, and photos of everything from repositioned trash bins to the lily bouquet. And at the center of it all, carefully positioned but impossible to miss, was the name: Karen Albright. Not demonized, not accused with vitriol, but clearly established as the initiating party behind a sustained, nonviolent harassment campaign dressed in procedural legitimacy. Allison didn't expect fireworks. She didn't expect handcuffs or dramatic consequences. But what she did expect, and what she was determined to achieve, was oversight. She wanted someone above Karen's reach to look at the pattern, to connect the dots, and to recognize what had been so deliberately disguised as neighborly concern. The office accepted her report and assured her a case manager would be assigned. In the days that followed, she waited, not passively but with quiet vigilance. She continued to maintain her property, pay her bills, and avoid direct confrontation. But she was no longer playing defense. The tide had turned. And then, just as quickly, the silence broke. It started with a letter, but this one was not from Karen or a county office. It was from a legal firm in town, Martin and Blake, representing the Lakeside Heritage Council, a private group with no regulatory authority but significant historical presence. The letter claimed that a recent pattern of escalating disruptions originating from Parcel 17B had prompted the council to file for a community impact review, a non-binding but publicly visible forum in which residents could speak on matters affecting the cultural and emotional well-being of legacy residents. The hearing, while technically unofficial, was being held at the public town hall and was open to comment, rebuttal, and transcription for publication in the local paper. It was a public relations trap. Allison, recognizing the move for what it was, prepared. She didn't panic. She didn't boycott. She attended. And when she walked into that room, filled with faces she'd seen behind hedges, on porches, in passing at the store, faces that had remained silent through every escalation, she carried with her a calm that could only come from truth. Karen was already seated in the center row, flanked by two women Allison had never spoken to but had seen delivering mailers door to door weeks prior. The moderator, a retired judge turned community liaison, called the meeting to order and invited statements. Karen went first. She stood slowly, as if burdened by the weight of leadership, and delivered a speech that was neither overtly hostile nor specific. She spoke of legacy, of memories, of the fragility of balance around sacred spaces. She did not name Allison. She did not mention the party, or the dock, or the complaint. She spoke instead in the abstract, in soft, mournful tones, invoking language like cultural erosion and displacement of neighborly values. The room nodded. She sat down. Then Allison stood. She didn't bring notes. She didn't bring witnesses. She brought her voice. She began not with accusations, but with herself. She explained who she was, where she came from, what had drawn her to the lake. She described the repairs she had made, the permits she had filed, the permits she had been denied. She detailed, without embellishment, the process of being isolated, targeted, and pushed, not by laws, but by a person who knew how to bend the suggestion of law into pressure. She listed the groups: preservation societies, ethical coalitions, liaison councils, none of them with authority, but all with presence. She spoke of the inspections, the letters, the lies disguised as caution, the suggestions passed off as community concern. And then, calmly, she said the name: Karen Albright. For a full second, the room didn't move. Allison didn't look at Karen. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke directly to the moderator and said, "My name is on every record. My documents are available to any person in this room. My complaint has been filed through official channels, and I will respect their findings. But I will not be chased from my land by whispers, not by petitions, not by invented rules. I am not a guest here. I am a resident." The silence was not applause, but it was power. The moderator thanked her. No rebuttal was allowed. 3 days later, the county integrity officer contacted her. A formal investigation had been opened. Karen would be notified. Interviews would be conducted. Allison's file had been accepted as preliminary evidence of targeted civic manipulation under the guise of procedural advocacy, a clause reserved for cases where personal campaigns exploited municipal tools to create false appearances of legality. It didn't guarantee anything, but it was a crack in the wall. That same day, Allison noticed the floodlight on Karen's shed had been turned off. The flyers stopped appearing. The motion hum never returned. There were no more men standing at the edge of the path. No more concerns from anonymous departments. For the first time since the evening of her gathering, the lake was just a lake. The water untouched, the air undecorated. And then came the letter, not addressed to her, but to Karen. It arrived by certified courier, a public copy left at the town's administrative board. A cease and desist recommendation, pending findings of the review panel, advising Missy Boone Albright to suspend any further third-party filings, group petitions, or unsolicited reports regarding Parcel 17B until the investigation concluded. It wasn't an indictment. It wasn't a conviction. But it was a flag, an official one that couldn't be rewritten by anecdote. Allison stood on her dock that evening and watched the sun drop behind the trees. She didn't celebrate. She didn't exhale relief. But she felt, for the first time, the ground beneath her steady. Not because Karen had stopped, but because Allison had made the system look back. The rules hadn't failed her. They had been misused. And now they were correcting. She didn't want revenge. She didn't want Karen's name ruined. She only wanted one thing: to live without having to earn her right to be left alone. Now, finally, that felt possible. The investigation didn't end with a press release or a courtroom drama. There were no reporters, no cameras, no apologies whispered into microphones. But over the course of 6 weeks, piece by piece, the machine that had quietly turned against Allison began to seize up. The inspector who had once visited her about water runoff sent a letter retracting the pre-corrective notice, citing incomplete grounds for concern. The planning office lifted the temporary denial on her shade structure permit, stating it had been flagged due to procedural irregularities not attributable to the applicant. Even the Lakeside Heritage Council, once the most vocal in their coded condemnation, issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging the need for greater clarity in how legacy-based concerns are raised and evaluated. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of a white flag. They weren't admitting guilt, but they were stepping back. Karen, for her part, made no public statements. She did not appear at the next 3 neighborhood events. Her flag was taken down from the porch. Her lattice gate, once always ajar, remained closed. Allison didn't gloat. She didn't throw a party. She didn't send out thank you notes or post online manifestos. What she did was simple. She resumed living. She hosted a quiet dinner for 2 friends on the dock, using lanterns instead of electric lights. She finished the boathouse restoration and painted it a deep slate gray. She applied for a local environmental grant to plant native shoreline vegetation, and it was approved without a single delay. No more surprise inspections. No more anonymous mail. No more passive eyes tracking her from porch shadows. One afternoon, as summer waned into early fall, she was walking back from her mailbox when she saw Karen standing at the corner of her own property, arms folded, not angry, just still. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Karen turned, not abruptly, not in retreat, and walked slowly back to her porch without a word. That was the last time Allison saw her. The lake remained. Its surface shifted with wind and birds and light, but never with judgment. Allison grew accustomed to that quiet again. The true kind, not the silence between battles, but the silence that comes when nothing is being stolen from you. She understood now how fragile peace could be when built around other people's expectations. She also understood the kind of strength it took to hold a boundary, not with force, but with documentation, clarity, and refusal to surrender what is rightfully yours. Months later, she was invited to speak at a local housing fairness forum. She declined. Not because she wasn't grateful, but because she knew better now. Her story wasn't a lesson. It wasn't a parable. It was a record. And records mattered. Records made patterns visible. Records stopped people like Karen from pretending they were simply misunderstood guardians of tradition. That winter, snow came early. Allison sat by her dock, wrapped in a coat, thermos in hand, and watched the surface ice form slow concentric circles beneath a fading gray sky. It wasn't a picture of victory. It wasn't peace branded in gold, but it was hers, earned, undeniable, undisturbed, and no one could take that from her again.